You ever feel like the world is going crazy? Have you had disagreements with people and walked away and said to yourself, it's like they live in a different reality? I think you may have been right. It could be they do live in a different reality. And what can look like the world going crazy starts to make sense when you think about it that way, as a conflict among different realities. And I think that if we hope to build peace, we're going to have to get a lot better at understanding that kind of conflict. People have always lived in different realities, also known as worldviews. We can't know the world as it is. Our limited senses and minds aren't up to that. So we build worldviews instead. A worldview is a simplified model of the world, something like a video game, in which there are rules and everything makes sense. This is a map from one of the oldest worldviews from 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia. It shows the city of Uruk at the center of the universe. And strangely enough, when people construct a worldview, they are likely to put themselves at the center of the universe. Most societies have had a dominant worldview. That's the one that everybody believes in, or at least pretends to. A dominant worldview holds the society together like a game where everyone's playing by the same rules. Some people have challenged their society's dominant worldview, but that can be risky. As Socrates found out in classical Athens when he would not stop asking questions about everything, and he ended up being ordered to commit suicide. Well, now we're conducting an experiment that I think even Socrates might find frightening. Can we have a society in which there is no agreed upon worldview? That can look a lot like a world that's falling apart. I'm going to focus on two of the most significant fragments of our fractious world, what Americans call the MAGA right and the woke left, although I'm putting an asterisk next to that word woke because it has more than one meaning. More about that later. It seems to me there's huge confusion about both of these groups, including in most of the media coverage of them. And I'm going to argue that that's largely because they're not really on the left or the right, as those words are usually understood. They're in different worldviews. The trouble is we keep thinking about politics as if everybody's in the same worldview. And in that one worldview, our mental model of politics looks like this, as a single line from left to right, on which we must be able to locate every single political opinion. And so we imagine that the woke left is over with the progressive liberals at the far end on the left, and we imagine the MAGA right is at the far right with the rock-ribbed conservatives. But I'm going to argue that this model is wrong, and in fact it only serves to increase the confusion that so many people feel these days. These groups can't all be found on the same line, and as we'll see, they don't even believe in the same line. It's more accurate to picture them as living within different worldviews. One of these worldviews has come to define the modern world, as we call it. But many of the people who are called woke reject that worldview, and many MAGA people do too. They inhabit different worldviews. Here's an example that demonstrates what I mean. In the modern worldview, individual freedom is a universal value. It's assumed that everybody believes in it, whether they're on the left or the right. But in the woke worldview that I'll be talking about here, that version of freedom can be seen as a form of oppression. And in the MAGA worldview, it can be seen as immoral. It's like they're in different realities, right? They are different worldviews. Not too long ago, it looked like the whole world might be coming together within one worldview. That's the one that emerged during the Enlightenment between about the late 1600s and the early 1800s. Scientific reason had produced such an explosion of new knowledge that many people began to believe that the whole of humanity was about to come together united by the principles of reason. One of the most inspiring events was Isaac Newton's discovery of what appeared to be fundamental laws of the universe. It's hard for us now to imagine the impact. The poet Alexander Pope compared it to a second creation of the world. He wrote, "Nature and nature's laws lay hid in night, God said, "Let Newton be," and all was light. You can see why it came to be called the Enlightenment. Reason also inspired new thinking about how to run a just and good society. The philosopher John Locke and others developed the principles of what would come to be known as liberalism, including universal human rights, individual freedom, equality, self-government, and the rule of law. When Thomas Jefferson wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident" at the beginning of the US Declaration of Independence, he had these principles in mind. And many people today still feel that they're self-evident, including, I'd expect, many people here with us in this room. Enlightenment, reason, and liberalism came to define the modern worldview. They produced so much progress so fast that some people began to think we might be approaching the end of history, meaning the goal history had been leading towards. The philosopher Georg Hegel wrote about that in the early 1800s, and the political scientist Francis Fukuyama famously did so again in the early 1990s. But even as the modern worldview was emerging back during the Enlightenment, it was beginning to split apart. The French Revolution was largely inspired by Enlightenment, reason, and liberalism. And we can think of the new French Assembly as a microcosm of the new modern worldview. Here, conflict would be negotiated through reasoned debate, according to the principles of liberalism, like liberté and égalité. And the French Assembly was also the birthplace of our left-right model of politics. When the delegates first began meeting to debate the future of France, they sat to the left or the right of the king, depending on how they felt about change versus tradition. But some of the delegates didn't even belong in the same room. They wanted to be in different worlds. The royalists wanted to restore the world of the past, ruled by God and the king. The radical Jacobins under Robespierre wanted to abolish the past and restart history from the year one. It turns out that the division between the Jacobins, the liberals, and the royalists was the start of a three-way conflict of worldviews that's been going on ever since. And I would say it continues now among the woke worldview, the modern worldview, and the MAGA worldview. The long history in the meantime is very complicated, and I can only touch on it here. But as I do, I hope you'll find that it helps to deconfuse our otherwise very confusing present day. I'll start with a look at the history that produced the MAGA worldview. It began with people who didn't want to live in a world defined by Enlightenment, reason, and liberalism. They believed that world lacked everything that mattered: morality, beauty, mystery, meaning. And many people still feel that way about it. Some people base their rejection of the modern worldview on religion. For them, God was the ultimate authority for everything we know about the world and how to live in it. And they believed society should be ruled by God's anointed rulers. The philosopher Joseph de Maistre said that otherwise the result could only be chaos and evil. And when the French Revolution descended into the reign of terror, he thought that proved him right. There's religious nationalists today who still agree with de Maistre. They think that everything that's going wrong with the world is because we've turned away from God. That doesn't describe all religious people, of course. There are many religious people who have found a way to reconcile their faith with the modern worldview. For other people, it wasn't only God who was far more important than reason and liberalism. So was the nation, at least as they conceived it. According to liberalism, a nation is a social contract among free people who agree to its laws and principles. But there were philosophers and artists and others who thought that sounded soulless. For them, a nation was much more than a contract. It was an ethnic people who shared a language, a culture, a homeland, and a deep, even spiritual connection. That's called an ethnic nation. Two of the early and most influential ethnic nationalists were the philosopher Johann Gottlieb Fichte and the opera composer Richard Wagner. Now, just like there are religious people who are also rational liberals, there are ethnic nationalists like that too. And many countries have been founded as ethnic nations because they were escaping domination. And many have become liberal democracies, like Germany and Italy, for example. But as ethnic nationalist or religious nationalist beliefs become more extreme, they become ever more authoritarian. Extreme ethnic nationalism led to the rise of Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, and led to the rise of lots of support for Nazism and fascism around the world, including more support among the democracies than we might like to think about. And right now, we're seeing a worldwide resurgence of religious and ethnic nationalism. It's very hard to make sense of the MAGA movement if you look at it from within the modern worldview. But MAGA does start to make sense if you look at it from within a worldview defined by religious and ethnic nationalism, which in MAGA world can range from moderate to extreme. Donald Trump's most committed followers see him as chosen by God or as the embodiment of the nation's spirit, or both. Their bond with him might be more mystical than rational. And when you listen to Trump speak, try thinking of his language as not so much rational as symbolic. He doesn't so much describe reality as use words to create it, like a king might, or a messiah, as he's suggesting more and more often. To understand the loyalty he commands, it helps to imagine a figure like that, not an elected official in a modern reason-based democracy. Now let's take a quick look at the history that produced the woke worldview. But first, I want to start by clarifying that adjective woke. As I mentioned, it has more than one meaning. The original meaning was coined by Black Americans and means basically awake to racial injustice. By that meaning, anyone within the modern worldview can and should be woke because to be aware of racial injustice is both reasonable and completely in line with liberal values. But by another meaning, people within the modern worldview can't be woke because, according to this meaning, the modern worldview is essentially built from injustice and oppression. So according to this worldview, to be woke means to wake up from the modern worldview. You become that kind of woke by learning a body of thought that might be described as postmodern critical theory, but is often just referred to as theory. According to theory, everything about the modern worldview is determined by relationships of power, and everything that people think is true or good within the modern worldview actually just serves the interests of power. That line of thinking is often traced to Karl Marx. Marx argued that one of the ways that capitalism kept the workers down was by generating a worldview that made their suffering look normal. So, for example, religion taught them that it was God's will and that if they behaved well, they'd be rewarded in the afterlife. Marxists describe the effect of believing in a capitalist worldview as false consciousness. But Marx thought that the awful suffering in the factories and slums of his time was about to wake the workers up. He predicted in 1848 an imminent global revolution. But the revolution didn't come. Some later Marxists tried to figure out what Marx had got wrong. That included these two, Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno. They were leaders of a school of thought known as critical theory. And when you hear about a critical theory of race or gender or other things, it probably has roots in their work. The critical theorists concluded that Marx had underestimated the power of a worldview to generate false consciousness. The workers of the world hadn't risen up because entertainment, advertising, and everything that surrounded them created a worldview that made capitalism look desirable. And Horkheimer and Adorno thought that Enlightenment reason was an essential component of this worldview because values like rationality, order, and productivity trained people to become cogs in the giant capitalist machine. The point of critical theory was to expose how that happens. There have been many, many other influences, including these two, who are a couple of the more influential ones, the philosopher Michel Foucault and the theorist of colonialism, Frantz Fanon. What's been assembled from all of the many sources of theory is a view of the Enlightenment not as a dawn of knowledge and freedom, but of false consciousness and oppression. According to theory, fundamentally modern liberal values might need to be challenged or even rejected. For example, the pursuit of objective truths and universal human rights is seen as potentially erasing the subjective truths of different people in different cultures, what's known as their lived experience. And equality can be seen as the same way. They see it as erasing differences among people, so that's why you'll hear people who are influenced by theory talking about diversity and equity instead of equality. And language is sometimes seen as dangerous and oppressive because language can be used to identify people or define the world for them. And so from this point of view, it might need to be limited. There might need to be limits on the cherished liberal value of free speech in order to prevent that through measures such as speech codes or cancellation. Now, as with the worldview that produced the MAGA right, the one that produced the woke left can become authoritarian, even though its purpose is to challenge authority of all kinds. One way of understanding how that can happen is to think again about the concept of false consciousness. If I think a theory has taught me to judge who has false consciousness and who doesn't, then I might conclude anybody who disagrees with me doesn't just have a different opinion, they have an incorrect opinion, because they obviously have false consciousness. This is the logic behind the concept of political correctness. If you follow that logic to its extreme, it ends up leading to the violent repression of dissent in the name of liberation, as happened under communist dictatorships and during the Reign of Terror. Today, though, it's far more likely to end up as the dogmatically intolerant version of wokeness that's often called cancel culture. The modern worldview can go very wrong too, like when Enlightenment was used to excuse colonial conquest with the pretext of spreading Enlightenment, or when bogus science was used to justify racism. My purpose here isn't to argue for or against these worldviews. It's to point out how fundamentally different they are and the challenge that poses for peace. In the Enlightenment tradition, peace is pursued by negotiating a compromise between opposing parties, searching for common ground. But what if there is no common ground? Because there isn't even a common worldview. That's the challenge we face now. I don't know if we're going to meet that challenge. But at the same time, I think there's at least some hope in uncertainty, if only because certainty so often leads to tyranny. If we're going to live in a world of peace, I think it's going to involve asking and welcoming lots of questions. Thank you.